All right, ladies and gentlemen, so today's screencast is going to focus on one aspect of Lyndon Johnson's domestic agenda, which he's going to call the Great Society. So we're going to focus on really some of the big issues that Lyndon Johnson is trying to fix within the United States, and why he's trying to fix them, and kind of what's driving his really reform ideology. So there's a couple things I want you guys to keep in mind as we go through this. So when you look at this, first of all, we're going to look at a lot of legislation that Lyndon Johnson is going to try and be instrumental in getting passed through Congress. So the first comparison you want to be able to make is to the New Deal, and to see if Johnson is continuing the legacy of the New Deal, or you think he's going in a different direction, or he has a different perspective than FDR had when he passed a lot of his New Deal legislation. Second thing, which is not listed here, but you also want to see if you could see a connection between Lyndon Johnson and the progressive era, and kind of the ideology that he's pushing here with his Great Society. Second thing, I want to see if you can see any connection between Johnson's ideas and radical Reconstruction. The third aspect, which I think is very important, Johnson's programs are going to be very divisive. During the time period, the 1960s is a time period where American liberalism is kind of at its height. And you see a lot of big liberal ideas and a lot of the liberal agendas getting instituted into law. Later on, you're going to have a major conservative movement that is kind of a backlash movement against the liberalism of the 1960s. So I want to see if you can understand, and it's important to understand the different perspectives here, the liberal and the conservative perspective, and also your own kind of opinion about each piece of legislation. So what we're going to start with, Lyndon Johnson, something that's key to his presidential domestic agenda and kind of at the core of his beliefs, is he wants to try and eliminate poverty within the United States. Lyndon Johnson grows up very poor, as we talked about, in Texas, and so he identifies with other poor Americans, and he wants the federal government to try and help them out. And so a major part of what becomes known as his Great Society program is specifically this war on poverty, trying to eliminate poverty within America, or at least decrease poverty within America. And so he's going to try and accomplish this by creating a lot of federal programs to help out the poor. So one of the first programs he creates is, or acts that's passed, called the Equal Opportunity Act. And this act creates the Office for Economic Opportunity, which is going to try and help poor Americans to find better jobs within the country. And they're going to create an organization called the Job Corps, which kind of trains poorer Americans for better professions, and kind of in more kind of like trade skills, that they can kind of go out and find jobs to kind of increase their economic standing within the country. So Johnson's trying to kind of eliminate poverty within American society. Now, part of it's trying to eliminate or to gain economic opportunities for poor Americans. Another part of it is trying to alleviate the burdens of being poor within America. So during Lyndon Johnson's administration, you're going to see kind of the increase of welfare provided to poor Americans and food stamp programs. So one program that's really kind of solidified during his presidency is called the SNAP program, which is basically a food stamp program. And so it provides the ability for Americans to present these food stamps at grocery stores to get groceries and get food, when otherwise they would have to use money that they might not have in order to gain this food. Now, this is going to be controversial stuff. Not really the food stamps, but kind of the expansion of the welfare, what's known as the welfare state within America. Helping out the poor is a great thing, trying to alleviate poverty. But critics of it, just like there's critics of the New Deal, critics of it are going to say you're going to create a dependent class that's going to be dependent on the government for food, dependent on the government for unemployment, dependent on the government for basically their own welfare. And this is where you get this idea, this negative connotation of the welfare state. It starts to expand in the 1960s because you go from a very, very small amount of Americans getting anything from the federal government to more and more Americans gaining, uh, food stamps and welfare programs. And I just recently read a statistic that they said that about 50 million Americans uh, are going to be on food stamps, in the upcoming year. And so the programs have grown tremendously over time. Now, Lyndon Johnson also tries to attack poverty by taking a page from President Kennedy's playbook as the president. So President Kennedy created the Peace Corps, which goes out to foreign countries and tries to basically build up foreign countries and through like a grassroots organization to help with poverty in these foreign countries and, go build up really third world nations. Johnson kind of takes the same idea and applies it to America. He says there's the same problems in America with poverty, and we need to kind of improve these situations within the United States. So he creates a program called VISTA, which is a domestic version of the Peace Corps. And basically you have volunteers, young people volunteers. You might have college-age kids or people who just graduate college that want to join this program. And they dedicate their time and they're volunteers and they go out into poor communities within America. They might do housing, or they might run kind of community projects to try and improve the living conditions within America. And so Johnson is, in this case, kind of looking internally into the United States to try and eliminate what he sees as too much poverty. We talked about the 1950s and the 1960s as an era, we called it the era of great prosperity. Johnson's going to look at this and he's going to say, there's a ton of inequality here in a country that has such great wealth and such great prosperity. We can't allow this poverty to continue. Another program that he's going to create is called the Head Start program. So the Head Start program is for people who are in poverty to get them get their children enrolled in a pre-K program. And you see programs like this now, really kind of trying to get like universal pre-K for all Americans. So he instituted this Head Start program because as probably a lot of your parents have preached to you, education can be a path to success. So if you can start early, if you can get a head start on your education, you can really kind of eliminate the kind of class differences that comes with growing up in a wealthy household versus a poor household. And a lot of that is the level of education you get from an early age. So if you can get out there and you get into pre-K early, you can kind of start to get rid of that difference between wealthy and poor Americans and their experience within the country. So another program, an education program, but designed to combat poverty within the United States. Another issue that Johnson kind of sees as a major issue is the elderly. So the elderly are some of your poorer Americans, and they're poor Americans for a couple of reasons. One, they're retired, so they may or may not have an income, a pension from their working years. Thanks to the New Deal and thanks to FDR, they're all going to receive some form of Social Security if they did work during their time period, or if their spouse worked during their working years. But he also wants to kind of extend this to try and provide health care for the elderly. So part of his Great Society program and his War on Poverty is the creation of Medicare, which is going to provide health insurance for the elderly. Now, why are the elderly a poor group in America, or at least at this time they're a poor group in America? It mainly has to do with the fact that the elderly are on a fixed income. And so as inflation increases over years and time, their income doesn't change. And so one of their biggest growing costs, the older you get, the more medical attention and medical care you need. And as we all know, and because it's been in the news, over the last 6-7 years due to Obamacare and the expansion of government-run health care, private health care, if you don't have health insurance, can be extremely expensive. And so this is your first example of the government expanding to provide more services and more health care for the American people. And you kind of see the legacy of that with the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, kind of taking that to extend that to all Americans. But it starts kind of here with Lyndon Johnson and the program of Medicare. Another way he's going to try and combat poverty is through government programs to provide better housing and cheaper housing for the poor. And this is specifically designed for urban areas. So when you look at what's going on in urban areas, one of the biggest problems in a city is the amount of income you have to pay for your housing. And if you're a poor American, you don't have as much income to dedicate to housing. So take like an example like New York City, where we live, and that the housing costs can be half of your salary. One of Johnson's goals is to create affordable housing for people. So he creates this act called the Omnibus Housing Act, which is designed, the federal government's going to build housing in areas like these apartment buildings you're looking at here, to kind of provide low-cost housing for poor Americans. Now, commonly in America now, we would call these housing projects. Okay, so these are first started in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, and his goal to kind of eliminate poverty and a part of his Great Society program. Now, in modern America, the housing projects have a very negative connotation because of what they've become. They've become areas that are known for high crime and violence and different negative stereotypes. But during the time period, it's designed to really combat what Johnson sees as unacceptable poverty and unacceptable living conditions for the poor within the United States. Now, those are some of the programs that are created as a part of Johnson's Great Society. So I just want to remind you of some of the things that you're looking for. What I would do, if you didn't do it during the screencast, is I would go legislation by legislation and kind of try and analyze it a little bit. Remember, in our class, the first thing you want to be able to do is to understand the information. The second thing you want to be able to do is analyze the information. So Johnson's trying to improve American society. That's why he calls his domestic agenda the Great Society. You have to be able to evaluate that. Did it improve America? Did it make America better? The liberal answer to this is absolutely. And so you'll have people during the 60s and 70s who advocate for these programs and the expansion of these programs, and you have a lot of people in the Democratic Party today who are kind of the modern, carry the modern legacy of the liberalism of the New Deal and President Johnson's Great Society. You also have a growing conservative movement who thinks that this is actually changing America for the worse, and that it's making Americans much more dependent on the government, and it's killing kind of the American spirit and the American drive. And that's going to become a popular movement in the late 70s and early 80s, and it's going to be something that ushers in another famous American president, Ronald Reagan. So it's important to understand the dynamics of it. So I want you guys to make sure that you take some time and you analyze this legislation and you kind of look at Johnson's presidency objectively. Our next screencast is going to be on the Vietnam War, and we're going to start in class with that when we come back over the break. So keep that in mind. The Vietnam War and Johnson's programs are kind of going on at the same time, and so is the Civil Rights Movement. And all of these things play off each other. And we're going to try and analyze a little bit of that and how each one affects the other during President Johnson's presidency in the mid to late 1960s. All right, guys. So we'll have another screencast on the Vietnam War coming up, later on, either tomorrow or later, early in next week.